Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And as ever, to the front pages of the newspapers. And if you want some kind of measurement of how strange this week is already turning out to be, this is the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. There's a tiny little story at the bottom here which simply says the autumn statement is to contain the most dramatic cuts ever. In another week, that would have been everybody's headlines. But you turn over, what are the headlines? Britain prepares for war. It's the Cameron plan. The Sunday Times has got it again there. Cameron's war plan to bomb ISIS. We'll be talking a lot about that in the programme. And the Observer puts the two stories together rather cleverly, revealed UK security chiefs in showdown with George Osborne. They want more armed officers and fewer cuts, not surprisingly. And then there's the Sunday Express. We can beat jihadis in 14 days, apparently, say military chief, which sounds to me a little bit like we're going to win the First World War by Christmas. Then there's a big poll in the Independent and many more stories to talk about. But thanks to all of my brilliant paper reviewers. Who's kicking off for us today? Paul, are you?
Yes, and the Sunday Times, the splash is the big story. Don't forget, Andrew, this week the Chancellor's going to be spraying around lots of facts and figures, but the only number that matters for David Cameron is the number on Syria, the number of Labour MPs who are going to vote with him for military action. The Sunday Times has some nice detail here, a stirring quote from the Prime Minister that he wants Britain to start behaving like Churchill, not Chamberlain, in coming weeks.
Fairly pointed.
And some detail, crucially, this Thursday the government are going to respond to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report on Syria with a 5-point plan, including how we'll have the legal basis for going to war, but also some of the detail in military. And I think that's pretty significant.
It's a very significant moment, clearly, for the country, but it looks to me, looking through the papers, as if the government is spraying out huge amounts of money on defence, including many more jets for the new aircraft carriers and more armed police and so forth.
That's certainly the case, but I have to say that when it comes to the whole calculus, parliamentary arithmetic that they're going to go through this week for the Prime Minister, the Labour Party's role in it is going to be crucial. And that's why in the Observer they have some key detail on page 7. And there's a quote here from Tom Watson that just leapt out for me, which is that it's for the shadow cabinet to make a final collective decision on the issue as well as our whipping arrangements. Now, the Labour Party is going through this whole problem at the moment. What does it do on Syria?
I think we need to explain to people what the situation is. So originally we thought that, like John McDonnell, who's coming on shortly, Jeremy Corbyn would be in favour of Labour MPs leaving it to their own consciences to decide whether they're in favour of war in Syria or not. But now he's changed his mind. He's saying, no, I'm leader of the Labour Party. We're going to vote against the government on this, and you all have to do the same. I'm going to whip you. But the significance of this is it's not really up to the leader to say that. It's up to the...
Exactly. What happened on Friday, the UN Security Council resolution, has changed the calculus significantly. There's lots of people like Hilary Benn, like Tom Watson, who are behind a broad swathe of the Parliamentary Labour Party who do want to take action. However, don't forget Jeremy Corbyn's got this enormous mandate of his own from his party members. I'm sure John McDonnell will refer to that. And those members are not that keen. They remember Iraq, they remember all the complications that came out of it, and they're pretty uncertain about whether or not they still want to do it.
Yes, so in fact, Jeremy Corbyn could be overruled by his own shadow cabinet, which would be an embarrassment,
it would,
to say the least. Stanley, you're a man of the left, and you've done a lot of work with the Labour Party in the past. Just give us an overview from your side of the pond about what's going on.
Well, I think, look, the Labour Party clearly has, after this last leadership election, is in a yet weaker position. We've seen polls, even in today's papers, where the leader is not in a strong position. And to be honest, Labour, as you know, did not address fundamental questions on immigration, spending, and a real economic offer that people can trust. And so you come into these kinds of decisions, both the spending review and Syria, with a public not very confident of a Labour Party.
So a friendly but uncertain view there. Stephanie, the spending review, again, is the real big news economically of the week.
I mean, as you mentioned, we would normally be focusing just on the autumn statement, but of course
That's why you're here.
on this key point, of security and cuts for the Home Office, of course the two issues come together and has put a lot of pressure, the events of the last week have put a lot of pressure on the Chancellor. And as you mentioned in your summary, you've got the security chiefs issuing a stark private warning to the government that Britain's counter-terror forces must be significantly boosted, let alone the kind of cuts that they were talking about, we have been talking about over the last few weeks. I mean, George Osborne, in a sense, has made this problem for himself, not just by having quite an ambitious target for a surplus in the budget at the end of
10 billion surplus at the end of it.
But actually, not just that, but the fact that these cuts, which might be manageable over the course across the whole of government spending, it's come down to maybe just 4 or 5 departments, of which Home Office is one, who are going to take maybe 30 or 40% cuts.
And someone's got a story about Theresa May digging in her kitten heels
Yes,
to take on.
Theresa May, I mean, formidable opponent for the Chancellor when it comes to this spending review. The Mail on Sunday say that even yesterday afternoon, Mrs May was still digging in, refusing his demand for double-digit cuts to the police. The reason the police numbers has infected this whole debate is obviously because of Paris and lots of warnings from the Metropolitan Police that we're reducing our capability if we cut the front line.
I mean, it's difficult because a lot of the sort of narrative that the Chancellor's had about the economy and why the UK's done well in the last few years, involves things like, our position in research and development, the digital economy, all of these things. If those areas, and the Sunday Times suggests that we are going to see support for industry in those areas slashed, it does get harder for him to make that case.
That's definitely. I'm not very thick. I'm a bit thick. I'm not very thick. And I've read reams and reams and reams about how the books are balancing and not balancing, and the fact that this month's borrowing figures, last month's borrowing figures, were very poor and all the rest of it. But I'm still a bit dazed by it. Give us an overview of how bad things are or not.
Look, I think he's not too far. By the standards of the overshoots of the last few years, I don't think you're going to see a massive hole reveal itself in the budget over the next,
but
over the next week.
£15 billion overshoot.
Well,
is that possible?
at this stage, it's not very long actually since the budget, since the start of the year. So actually, I don't think, in start of the tax year. So I don't think. I mean, we may have some slippage this year on borrowing. I think the bigger problem he has, which you've already mentioned, is that you had that big hole in his plans for welfare cuts blown by the House of Lords. He's now got to find somewhere else to get quite a lot of his welfare cuts that were going to be for working tax credits for working people. I think that could cause him some trouble, and it may mean that he has to lower that surplus target for the end of at the end of the Parliament.
And you've picked, I think, an Observer story on that subject.
Well, so the Observers. Well, I think we're talking about. I think that was one of the key things was just highlighting the Sunday Times.
Sorry, Sunday Times. Apologies.
But it is this point about he's got the several billion he may have to find that he was hoping to get in cutting tax credits. He could get a few advantages. There's some of those forecasting changes. Interest rates are going to be even lower than we thought for longer than we thought. Some of those things could help him. But this is a very tough time. And as I say, he's narrowing the cuts down to a very small proportion of departments, which means the pain for them is very great.
Very severe indeed. Stanley, you've got a story, I think, from the Telegraph that you'd like to share.
Indeed, I do. This is a story that says that Enoch Powell was right, which brings us back. And what Simon Heffer
talks about, who was Enoch Powell's biographer.
Yes, and what Simon Heffer writes about is about multiculturalism. And about the dangers of multiculturalism taking hold in Britain, and how that invites everything we are watching now. And we have to get serious about borders. We have to get serious about bringing people into a common culture. As you know,
is that kind of very hardline message ringing out across America at the same time?
Well, I think it is ringing out in the Republican Party, and it's really, I think, quite important in trying to look at what's happening in America. We do have a story here that we're looking at about the fury about Donald Trump talking about registering Muslims.
He actually wants every Muslim in America to be registered. It's like the Jews in Nazi Germany. They're not actually going to have armbands with red crescents, but we're not far away from that in that kind of thinking, are we?
Yeah, it's quite crazy, but you should know it's not America. I have a new book, as you know, America Ascendant.
America Ascendant. And in that book, you basically argue that America's liberal traditions, as embodied in this case by Hillary Clinton, will be triumphant over the next decade or two.
Yes, well, I think we're at a tipping point moment right now. Huge growth in diversity and acceptance of multiculturalism, belief that the country is better off being diverse with an immigrant population. The opposite of what you're seeing with Trump. I think the opposite of what you're seeing in Europe, and it's part of why America's next.
Well, it's an absolutely acid moment for all these Western democracies. We've all become kind of global societies, pulling in people from all around the world, and we've grown from that reason. We've got lots of energy from that. But now this is the first moment when a lot of European countries too are saying our borders have now got to be closed. Can we carry on with Schengen? Can we carry on with a borderless Europe? Or is that dream now over?
No, and I think it's for the UK, it becomes an interesting as part of the lead up to the referendum. In fact, we have in the Observer, there is an article from a former police chief, Sir Hugh Ord, saying that actually it will be harder to tackle jihadists, tackle terrorism if we left the EU. You know, for us, the importance of collaboration with the rest of the EU, you know, comes through in this and may affect that referendum campaign in ways that we don't predict. But in Europe, I think this fear that open borders, particularly within the Schengen area, is actually helping terrorists to come in, whether true or not, is putting enormous pressure on support for integration there. And I've heard so many different opinions from senior members, technocrats and politicians in Europe this week who are divided on how important Schengen is and whether that's something that has to give in order to reassure people that actually the EU can protect them.
Very, very important moment. Now, George Osborne, who'll be here later on, has given an interview, meanwhile, to The Observer, which is looking very kind of, I don't know, presidential or something.
Well, this is we've got our Sunday Times and our Observers all over the place this morning, but this is a big
Sunday
interview
Times.
with the Sunday Times, but he has actually done articles for other newspapers as well. I mean, it's interesting because we've been talking about George Osborne's stature rising over the last few months, hear him talking more about national security. This week he's going to be talking about national security, which you would consider, you know, if someone who wants to be a Prime Minister in waiting, that sounds great. But if he's talking about cuts, if he's under pressure at the same time, that makes quite a difficult week.
And he in particular is under pressure, Paul, wasn't he? Because he was the great sort of triumphal guru of the election campaign, and then the wheels came off a bit with that House of Lords vote and subsequently.
Very much so. I mean, Stephanie's right. George Osborne's main aim throughout these next 5 years is to present himself as Prime Ministerial. Obviously, the economy is working in his favour, but when it comes to big issues like GCHQ, he made a speech there last week. He's doing all these little building blocks that Prime Ministerial looks should feature. The problem for the Conservatives is that we've got today a good old-fashioned Tory sex sleeve
I want
story.
to talk a lot about sex with you in just a second, Paul. But before we do that,
We're talking about austerity now.
there is a poll, I think, in the Independent on Sunday, which shows that George Osborne is now quite unpopular with the public as a whole.
Yes, we haven't got it here, but there is a poll that shows that George has a minus 18 rating, I think, in the favourability index. Jeremy Corbyn, it has to be said, has gone down, and he's minus 28. In the calculus of the Tory party leadership, through that prism most things are viewed these days, Boris is plus 17, Theresa May is minus 4. I'm sure George will think that just digging in what he's doing it will pay off in the end, but let's see.
OK, and so on to the story of the week, because lots of people would think that war and peace and the economy and cuts matter a lot, but in a lot of papers, it's the so-called Tatler Tory and a good old-fashioned Tory sex scandal, which brings us back to the 1990s. Makes my eyes misty with nostalgia.
Well, the Mail on Sunday has done everyone proud in that sense. It's a classic Sunday paper story. They've got lots of detail. This guy called Mark Clark, who was a leading election aide for the Tories in the general election, has been accused of all sorts of things, from bullying to blackmail. He denies them, I have to say, quite clearly at this point.
And he's been kicked out of the Tory party, am I right?
He was kicked out this week, kicked out for life. But the Mail on Sunday have more detail today about things like sex on pool tables, all sorts of stuff that the readers might want to read or may not. But from my point of view, I thought what was interesting about this story is the impact for the taxpayer. The Sunday Times have a separate line, which is Rob Halfon, who was allegedly blackmailed about having an affair with a mistress, used taxpayers' money to claim expenses on his London tryst, this London club where he stayed with a mistress. Now, most of us wouldn't care about that, but the Sunday Times actually points out a great quote here from the IPSA, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, saying, we just pay for the room. It's up to MPs what they do with it. Which I think is a brilliant quote.
Fantastic. Well, I always like to leave the paper review on a morally uplifting note.
Indeed.
So, Paul, Stan, Stephanie, thank you all very much for the paper review.